More fallout from Trump's tariffs. Automaker Stellantis is temporarily halting production.
If I had to talk to Donald Trump, I would say drop the tariffs. Canada is your friend. We're your ally. We're going to do what we have to do to keep threatening our sovereignty.
I've been a little bad. Did buy a little bit from Amazon yesterday, but today nothing like that.
5 companies, 5 industries, one shared decision pull out of the U.S. market, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. By the final week of May 2025, a series of unexpected corporate moves sent tremors through the U.S. economy. In a matter of days, 5 major companies, Stellantis, Apple, MGA Entertainment, Alcoa, and Chinese e-commerce giants Temu and Shein, all announced significant shifts in their global operations, effectively reducing or halting U.S. market involvement. The trigger wasn't a war, it wasn't a financial meltdown, it was tariffs. The most dramatic example came from Stellantis' parent company of Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge, which announced layoffs of 900 U.S. workers and paused several domestic assembly lines. The company cited new 25% tariffs on imported vehicles and components, many of which it sources from Mexico, Canada, and Europe, as the reason. With nearly half of its U.S. vehicle inventory previously imported, Stellantis concluded the numbers simply no longer added up. Apple, too, pivoted quickly. Having already diversified some iPhone production into India in prior years, the company announced that all iPhones sold in the U.S. would now be assembled in India. This move followed an aggressive tariff hike on electronics sourced from China, pushing Apple to accelerate its China Plus One strategy. As of Q2 2025, iPhone exports from China to the U.S. were down over 70%, while Indian exports surged, reflecting a broader supply chain migration. Meanwhile, Alcoa, one of the largest aluminum producers in North America, halted its aluminum exports from Canada into the U.S., redirecting supply toward European and Asian markets. With cross-border tariffs rising under the latest wave of the Trump administration's Liberation Day trade policies, even NAFTA-era advantages no longer held. Shipping into the U.S. had become economically irrational, and Alcoa's customers would have to look elsewhere or pay more. In retail, the collapse was subtler, but just as impactful. Shein and Temu, Chinese e-commerce juggernauts known for rock-bottom prices and fast fashion, began hiking prices by up to 40% or discontinuing U.S. shipments altogether. The rollback of the de minimis exemption, previously allowing goods under $800 to enter duty-free, now meant nearly all small online orders were taxed, in some cases up to 145%. Shein canceled upcoming marketing campaigns in North America, and Temu began running down its U.S. inventory without replenishment. Finally, MGA Entertainment, the maker of LOL Surprise and Bratz dolls, announced it would shift over 50% of its production out of China, redirecting to India and Southeast Asia. The company warned that U.S. toy inventories could shrink by holiday 2025 as import costs skyrocketed and shipping routes were reworked. Retail giants like Walmart and Target were already revising their Q4 planning and pricing strategies. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were the economic equivalent of pulling fire alarms. For companies built on complex global supply chains, the United States, once a cornerstone market, was becoming a liability. Overnight tariff risk had morphed into a fundamental cost risk. And while political rhetoric framed these tariffs as tools of protectionism, corporate America had a different interpretation. Protection that raises your costs isn't protection, it's pressure. And so, one after another, they made the same call. It's time to move. On January 31, 2025, President Donald Trump, during his second term in office, reinstated a sweeping set of trade tariffs, reviving the spirit of his earlier trade war, but under a more aggressive new label, Liberation Day. The move imposed import duties ranging from 25% to 45% on consumer and industrial goods coming from China, the European Union, Mexico, and Canada, the very countries that make up the backbone of America's supply chain for everything from smartphones to car parts to clothing. But the policy shift didn't stop at traditional goods. It also took direct aim at one of the fastest-growing segments of modern commerce, low-cost international e-commerce. The Trump administration revoked the long-standing de minimis rule, which had previously allowed shipments under $800 to enter the U.S. without incurring import taxes. For millions of Americans who had become accustomed to ordering directly from platforms like Shein, Temu, or AliExpress, this change meant a sudden and steep increase in prices, sometimes overnight. A $30 pair of shoes or $15 household gadget now faced duties that pushed final costs 30% to 70% higher. For manufacturers, the impact was immediate. Many had already begun shifting production from China during the original 2018 to 2020 trade war, building fragile but functional networks across Southeast Asia. But the new tariffs also swept up European and North American partners, making even friendly sourcing risky. The message was clear: no one was exempt and nothing was stable. For retailers, it meant an impossible bind. Pass the new costs onto consumers and risk losing customers. Absorb the costs and erode already thin margins. For global brands, it raised an even more unsettling question: is the U.S. still a stable place to invest, scale, or manufacture? And so even before factories shuttered or job cuts were announced, the real impact had already begun. Confidence, not capital, was the first to flee. As the realities of the Liberation Day tariffs began to sink in, some of America's largest companies were forced to make rapid strategic decisions, not out of ideology, but out of necessity. The cost of continuing to operate in the U.S. under a volatile and expensive trade regime had become too high for many firms to justify. For them, the question was no longer political, it was practical. Is staying in the U.S. market still financially viable? Stellantis, the automotive giant behind brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, was among the first to act. With nearly half of the vehicles it sold in the U.S. coming from abroad, the company faced immediate exposure to the new tariffs, which imposed up to 25% duties on imported cars and parts. Rather than absorb these new costs or pass them on to already price-sensitive consumers, Stellantis announced the suspension of several production lines and the cancellation of a planned domestic expansion. The result was a wave of layoffs, cutting 900 jobs. Internally, executives described the decision as stopping the bleeding, a necessary move to prevent long-term damage in an increasingly unstable market. Apple responded differently, but just as decisively. Although the company has long relied on Chinese factories to assemble iPhones for global markets, the renewed tariffs on Chinese-made electronics made that model untenable for U.S. sales. Rather than wait for further policy reversals, Apple accelerated its shift to India. By May 2025, the company had transitioned nearly all U.S.-bound iPhone production to Indian facilities run by Foxconn and Tata. Export data showed a 75% decline in iPhone shipments from China to the U.S. within just 3 months, while Indian exports surged to fill the gap. Without issuing a press release or making a political statement, Apple had restructured a key pillar of its supply chain because the numbers demanded it. Chinese e-commerce giants Shein and Temu, which had built their U.S. empires on direct-to-consumer shipping models, were hit even harder. The elimination of the de minimis exemption, which had allowed packages under $800 to enter the country duty-free, effectively destroyed their business model. Suddenly, every item shipped to the U.S. was subject to full customs duties, sometimes reaching as high as 145% depending on product type. In response, both companies began raising prices and quietly halting new shipments from China. Digital ad campaigns were canceled, U.S. inventory was depleted without replacement, and consumers who once enjoyed ultra-cheap prices were left facing delays and sticker shock. The disruption was swift and mostly silent. For MGA Entertainment, the maker of Bratz and LOL Surprise dolls, the tariffs arrived at the worst possible time. With the holiday shopping season just months away, the company scrambled to reroute half of its production out of China to plants in India and Southeast Asia. Even with this adjustment, MGA warned that inventories in the U.S. would be tight and that prices for popular toys would be noticeably higher by the 2025 holiday season. Major retailers like Walmart and Target were forced to rewrite their entire seasonal procurement strategies months ahead of schedule, bracing for fewer shipments and higher wholesale costs. Even U.S. producers weren't immune. Alcoa, a major aluminum supplier with cross-border operations in Canada, quietly began shifting its export routes away from the United States altogether. Under the new tariff structure, selling aluminum into the U.S., even from NAFTA partner Canada, was no longer cost-effective. Instead, Alcoa began focusing on European buyers, where trade policy was seen as more predictable and stable. It was a telling move. For the first time in decades, the U.S. was no longer the automatic destination for North American industrial output. These developments weren't just tactical retreats. They were a symptom of something deeper, an erosion of economic confidence in the United States as a predictable, rules-based market. Across sectors and industries, corporate leaders came to the same conclusion. It wasn't necessarily the tariffs themselves that made staying unsustainable, it was the unpredictability of when and how those policies would change again. In boardrooms from Detroit to Delhi, the question that now dominates discussions about the U.S. market is no longer, how do we grow there, but rather, is it still worth it? The cost of loyalty, it turns out, may be higher than the cost of leaving. The aftershocks of the tariff escalation were not confined to corporate balance sheets or international trade ledgers. They reached directly into the wallets and shopping carts of everyday Americans. By mid-2025, the effects of rising import duties were showing up where it hurts the most: retail prices, delivery delays, and shrinking product availability. Across the country, consumers began noticing a sudden uptick in prices for smartphones and electronics, especially iPhones and Android devices previously manufactured in China. Tariffs of 25% to 35% on imported components and finished goods pushed wholesale costs higher, forcing retailers to raise sticker prices or reduce promotions. For the average American household, replacing a phone or upgrading a laptop now costs significantly more than it did just a few months earlier, not because of inflation or supply shortages, but because of tax policy. In the toy aisles, a different problem emerged: scarcity. As companies like MGA Entertainment rerouted production and adjusted logistics in response to tariff hikes on Chinese-made goods, inventories in U.S. warehouses began to shrink. Toys that would have flooded shelves in the run-up to the 2025 holiday season arrived in smaller quantities or not at all. Retailers issued early warnings: prepare for higher prices, fewer discounts, and thinner selections, especially for high-demand items like collectible dolls, puzzles, and action figures. The combination of shipping delays and rising costs made even standard stocking strategies untenable. In the auto sector, the impact took a more structural form. SUVs and trucks, many of which rely on cross-border parts from Mexico and Canada, saw production schedules disrupted and delivery windows pushed back. In some cases, buyers waited weeks longer than expected, while others were offered fewer trim options due to parts shortages. Dealerships, meanwhile, raised prices to offset rising import costs. A vehicle that might have cost $39,000 in early 2024 now came with a $42,000 or $43,000 price tag in mid-2025, all while wages remained stagnant for most working-class consumers. But perhaps the most widespread consequence was invisible to the casual observer: the ripple effect on input materials and supply chain logistics. Prices for raw aluminum affected by Alcoa's rerouting of Canadian exports climbed steadily in Q2. Semiconductor prices, already volatile after the pandemic-era shortages, spiked again due to duties on imports from Asian markets. Even shipping and warehousing became more expensive as companies restructured to navigate the new trade map. These increases didn't just affect a handful of industries, they embedded themselves into the final cost of everything from home appliances to bicycles to air conditioners. In the end, the tariffs didn't just raise prices or reroute supply chains, they redefined the risk profile of doing business in America. What was once the world's most reliable, rules-based market became almost overnight a landscape of unpredictable costs, politicized trade decisions, and disappearing long-term incentives. Factories pause, shipments slow, prices rise, and the silent casualty is not just economic growth, but trust. For policymakers, the lesson is clear: trade tools without legal grounding or strategic vision may win headlines, but they lose economies. When tariffs are imposed as a show of strength, but reversed by courts or abandoned after triggering economic blowback, the damage lingers long after the policies themselves expire. What businesses need isn't protection, it's clarity. What consumers need isn't nationalism, it's stability.